Okay, today we are back with a midrange deck after we looked at a control deck last time. You might ask yourself, what is a midrange deck? I would define a midrange deck as a deck that is adaptable and tries to take on different roles depending on the matchup. Against aggressive decks, you want to go to the late game, win with your stronger cards and accrue value. Against control decks, you also sometimes want to accrue a bit of value, but you don't want to go to the long game because the control deck has access to better cards and sweepers which can really disrupt you. So you want to take them out as quickly as possible. But you are not as fast as aggressive decks, so you need to rely on some interactive creatures and other types of interaction to stop the control deck from disrupting you. This is a black-white deck, or the color combination is also known as Orzhov, and it is very similar to an archetype called Hatebears. So it plays a lot of creatures that can interact with your opponent, with their hand, with stuff on board. And I really like this deck. I had a lot of success with it in my casual kitchen table matches, and it is quite fun to play. This deck really facilitates learning to play better because many of the cards have very tricky effects, and we will talk about them when they come up. I'm going to talk about this deck by going through the different mana value slots. So we're going to talk about the 1 drops first and finish with the 5 drops. Afterwards, we're going to take a brief look at the mana base, and then I'm going to show you a couple of cards that you might include in this deck depending on what cards you have access to. So let's jump right into it. The 1 drops in this deck are as following. We have Thraben Inspector, Recruitment Officer, and Kythion, Hero of Arcros. Thraben Inspector is just a very good 1 drop because it gives you a clue which can be turned into a card later on, and it gets you some board presence early in the game. Recruitment Officer is a bit more aggressive with its 2 power, so you can apply more pressure on your opponent in the early game. And if you have some mana lying around in the late game and not much to do with it, you can activate its ability to find yourself new cards. We also have Kythion, Hero of Arcros, which is just a very cool card. It is played nice to attack with him and 2 other creatures, flip him, and get a Gideon Planeswalker. This card kind of tells the story of the upbringing of Gideon, and I just really like the card. You can also make him indestructible to protect him in combat or against removal spells. If you get him to flip, he becomes this Planeswalker, Gideon Battleforged, which is a pretty strong card, considering the fact that you only paid 1 mana for it. It can become a 4/4 human soldier with indestructible with its 0 ability, so it can apply a lot of pressure. It also can protect your own creatures with the +1, or it can force opposing creatures to attack him if you need to get them out of the way to attack back, or if you don't want to get hit by them in your face. I really like the Gideon card, and it's always fun to flip him. Now we get into the disruption slot. The 2-drop slot is where we find most of our interactive creatures. We have Tide Hollow Sculler. He enters the battlefield, the opponent reveals the hand, you choose a non-land card from it and exile that card. If he leaves the battlefield, your opponent gets access to the card again. This is a card that really facilitates the good play I was talking about earlier, because you really have to get a good grasp on how the game is going and which of your opponent's cards might be able to beat you, so you can take them out of their hand and deny them access to that card for a couple of turns. You will run into some problems if you have never played with effects like these, but just trust me, after a couple of rounds you will know which cards to take, and sometimes it doesn't work out, but you have to accept it. This card is just a temporary removal of the card in your opponent's hand, but it can still be quite strong. We also have Silverquill Silencer. This card enters the battlefield and you choose a non-land card name, and when your opponent casts a spell with the chosen name, they lose 3 life and you draw a card. Also a card that really facilitates knowing the opponent's cards and learning about their strategy, because you will need to know which cards in the deck are very important for their strategy, so you can name them and get a benefit when they cast those cards. It's also a 2-power 3/2, so it can apply a lot of pressure. and after a couple of games against any particular deck, you will know which cards you should name. And it is quite fun to learn with cards like Title Scholar and Silvercore Silencer to play better and to understand your opponent's game plans. We also have Tithe Taker. This disrupts your opponent's ability to interact with you during your turn by making spells they cast one more to cast and abilities one more to activate. It is quite nice against decks that rely on counter spells, or if your opponent wants to play a combat trick during your turn or kill one of your creatures. This makes it harder for them to do that. He also has the Afterlife ability, which means when he dies, you get a 1/1 flyer, 1/1 flying token. This card just trades in combat, and afterwards you will still have a 1/1 flyer laying around, so you can attack your opponent, and this makes Tithe Taker just a solid little value creature. We also have some non-creature interaction in the 2-drop slot in Heartless Act and Humiliate. Heartless Act is just a removal spell. You can play any number of black and white removal spells in this slot, but I chose to go for Heartless Acts because I had them lying around, and it is just a perfectly fine removal spell which will work against most decks you are going to face. Humiliate is another disruption spell. This one takes a card out of your opponent's hand and they don't get access to that card again. You also get a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control, so if you are able to play a 1-drop and then follow this up with a Humiliate on turn 2, your 1-drop will grow and get in for even more damage. In the 3-drop slot, we have Elite Spellbinder, another disruptive card that gives you the ability to look at your opponent's hand. You can choose a non-land card from it and exile that card. Your opponent is still able to play that card, but it costs 2 more to cast. If you are able to take important cards, especially important top-end cards from your opponent, they will need quite a long time to get to them. Just think about taking a 6-drop from their hand. Now the 6-drop costs 8 mana, and hopefully you will kill your opponent before he reaches that 8th land drop. He is also a 3/1 flyer, so in combat he just flies over most things and deals a lot of damage. We also have Preacher of the Schism. This is a value creature. He doesn't really interact with your opponents, but if he attacks while you have the most life, you will draw a card and lose 1 life. And if he attacks while you have less life than your opponent, you will get a 1/1 vampire token, which can stabilize you because he has lifelink. The Preacher of the Schisms also has Death Touch, so it is quite hard to kill him in combat. I really like this card. I am considering playing more of them, but at the moment I run 2 copies. He's a really solid value engine, and it is quite strong when you get to attack with him and repeatedly draw more cards to find more of your interactive creatures. We also have Redain, God of the Worthy, as a one-off. This is occasionally good against snow decks because it makes snow lands enter the battlefield tapped, but we mostly use her for her second ability. Non-creature spells your opponents cast with CMC 4 or greater cost 2 more to cast. This makes it hard for them to play board wipes or other expensive cards, which is very strong because your deck sometimes struggles against board wipes, and if they have to wait 2 turns more to get to a board wipe, this usually means you are able to win the game. Redain also has a backside which rarely comes up, but sometimes you will play her as Valkmira Protector's Shield. This is particularly strong against token decks because it prevents 1 damage of every time you take damage from any source. So if your opponent has a board full of 1/1s, they're basically dealing no damage to you. It also protects stuff of yours from getting targeted by making the spells or abilities that target stuff 1 more to cast. The second ability on this card can be good, but most of the time you will play her on the front side because you're scared of their big cards, and making like a 1 mana removal spell cost 2 can be nice, but it is usually not as important as making their bigger cards more expensive. We also are running 2 Anguished Unmaking in the 3-drop slot as another form of removal. This is quite nice because it can hit any type of non-land permanence. You have to pay 3 life in addition, but it is worth it because this card is very flexible. It can hit planeswalkers, it can hit creatures, artifacts, enchantments, and sometimes you just need to deal with those card types, which is why I'm choosing to include 2 Anguished Unmakings. In the 4-drop slot, we get to some of our more impactful cards like Seraph of the Scales. It is a 4/3 flyer for 4 mana, so this card just deals a ton of damage. We can also give the angel flying or death touch, vigilance or death touch, sorry. Which means if we need a blocker, we can give her vigilance, so she stays back and can help us defend against our opponent's boards. And if our opponent somehow gets into combat with the angel and we need to give a death touch, this is also a possibility. And you see the Afterlife 2 keyword. When the angel is dealt with, you still get 2/1 flying tokens to keep the pressure up. I chose to include one Basilica Bellhound. This is a card that can help you stabilize against aggressive decks by gaining you 3 life when it enters the battlefield. It also forces your opponent to discard a card, so it is fine against midrange or control decks because it is still a 2-for-1. You get a creature and you get a card out of the hand. This is certainly not the strongest 4-drop you can run in this slot, but I just like the card and it fills quite a lot of roles by giving us life and being a 2-for-1. I'm also running a Silver Quill Command. This is a very flexible 4-drop. It can act as a spell that removes something on the opponent's side and draws your card or gets something back. Sometimes we can give a creature +3/+3 and flying to get into the air and deal massive damage to our opponents. This is just a very flexible card and another of those cards that facilitates good play and that makes you think about your decisions, and that is one of the play patterns I really like in this deck. The real spice comes in the 5-drop slot, where I'm choosing to play 3 different legendary creatures. We have Vona, Butcher of Magan, a 5 mana 4/4 Vigilance Lifelink Vampire Knight that is not the strongest 5-drop, but the ability to destroy target non-land permanent can come in handy against like planeswalkers or artifacts, enchantments that you otherwise have a hard time dealing with. Also, a 4/4 body with vigilance and lifelink is strong in combat and helps you against aggressive matchups. We also are running Obsidian Ghost Council, which was a very good card in its standard format. And still, when this card enters the battlefield, it drains the opponent for 2. Your opponent loses 2 life, you gain 2 life. And at the beginning of your end step, you can exile him. If you do that, you return him to the battlefield during your next turn, and he gains haste, so you get the ETB trigger again, which drains your opponent for an additional 2. This puts a really fast clock on your opponent, and it is hard to deal with him, because sorcery speed removal, like board wipes or other sorcery speed cards, basically can never interact with this card, because you can always use the second ability to exile him, and when your opponent is taking his or her turn, he won't be on the battlefield to interact with. A very fun card to play with, and a frustrating card to play against sometimes, but this is exactly what we want out of our 5-drops. I'm also running an Archangel Everson, a 5 mana 4/4 flying flash vigilance angel that gives your whole team indestructible when she enters the battlefield. This is a very strong. I frequently get to play around board wipes with this card and protect my whole team by giving all of them indestructible. And sometimes this card flips. This happens when a non-angel creature you control dies. then you get to transform Everson at the beginning of your next upkeep. She becomes a 6/5 flying angel, which is a very good clock. And in addition to that, she also deals 3 damage to each other creature and each opponent. This may kill some of your own creatures, but it oftentimes kills a ton of their creatures and applies even more pressure because the 3 damage is also hitting their face. All of those cards are very solid finishers, but there's a ton of strong 5 mana cards that you may want to include in this deck. Just try out what you are a fan of, and maybe you will find success with one of the many 5-drop planeswalkers there are, but those are the creatures I chose to go for. Regarding the mana base, I'm including 10 basics, 5 swamps, 5 plains, and 1 Windbrisk Heights. This is some additional value from our mana base. It has Hideaway 4, it enters the battlefield, you look at the top 4 cards of your library, exile one of them face down, and put the rest of them on the bottom in a random order. And whenever you attack with 3 or more creatures, you can pay 1 mana, tap the land, and cast the card for free. This may come as a big surprise to opponents when you're in the middle of combat and just cast like a Avacyn for free of this land. Uh, it it is quite a nice land to have against slower decks because this is where you are most likely to attack with 3 or more creatures. For dual lands, I'm running 4 Caves of Koilos and 4 Concealed Courtyards. Those are just some rare dual lands that are currently pretty cheap and still pretty strong dual lands. They enter the battlefield untapped in the first couple of turns. Caves of Koilos may deal a bit of damage to you over the course of a couple of turns, but it is still very important to fix your mana, which is why I included those lands. I also run 1 Temple of Silence. It ETBs tapped, but it gives you Scry 1, and it fixes your mana. And another solid option in the land slot to fix your mana. Additionally, I run 2 Restless Fortress. This is another tapped land that fixes your mana, and in addition to that, it can become a 1/4 Black Nightmare creature until end of turn for 4 mana. And when this creature attacks, the defending player loses 2 life, you gain 2 life. This is a very good option to attack control decks, because if they wipe your board, you still have the Restless Fortress in your mana base and are able to attack them on the next turn right away by activating the land and attacking. This makes it hard for them to clear out all of your threats, and it can also come in handy if you need a bit of life gain. Just a very solid creature land in the mana base. We also have 1 Orzhov Basilica to live the dream with the Windbrisk Heights. If you get to play the Hideaway card with Windbrisk Heights, bounce it with Orzhov Basilica, and play the Windbrisk Heights again, you feel like you outplayed your opponent on a whole nother level. Most of the time it isn't necessary to go for a play like that, but Orzhov Basilica is also in every other use case a perfectly fine dual land, and I just really like bounce lands in my casual decks. I also run 1 Blighted Fen. This is just some added value in the mana base. In the late game, we can get your opponent to sacrifice a creature for 5 mana, which, yeah, it isn't the strongest ability on a land, but it can certainly come in handy if you need to deal with some of your opponent's stuff in the late game. This was on the whole deck tech. This is a very flexible deck. There are many creatures in the history of Magic that are able to disrupt your opponents. So you can tune this deck to your heart's desire. You can choose to try out many different cards. I would encourage you to experiment around with this deck and find your own playstyle. You find some cards that are worth including in a deck like this in almost every set. So just go through your collection and pick out what you like. This is just a skeleton, an example of how I build a deck like this. Some other cards that are noteworthy and might be a good inclusion in your decks are Thalia Heretic Cathar. She has a nice body at 3/2 first strike, and she also makes creatures and non-basic lands enter the battlefield tapped under your opponent's control, which slows your opponents down, makes it hard for them to deploy blockers, and messes with their mana base if they chose to run a lot of non-basic lands. Teysa Opulent Oligarch is a really strong value engine. She spits out clues if your opponent lost life at your end step, and she gives you 1/1 flyers when you sack your clues. She can build an army all by herself and gives you a lot of value in the mid to late game. I'm certainly going to try her out. We also have Drana in Linvala, which might be the perfect card for you if decks you run into often rely on activated abilities of creatures, because she just prevents them from being activated, and she also steals all of those activated abilities. Another nice card you can try out depending on what decks you face in your casual games. I hope you found some inspiration in today's video. I really encourage you to try out a deck like this. It is very fun. You feel like you get to make a lot of decisions and have a lot of control over your games, while still not running a full-on control deck. Yeah, please tell me in the comments if you want to see something specific for the next video, or if you have any card suggestions for this deck today. Thank you for watching. Bye!